We know why you clicked. A girl with her back to the camera, that American flag patch sitting right where the eye naturally wanders, and some old digger standing behind her with a look on his face like he just found water in the desert. And that caption, "We covered their rear all month." Now I know what you were thinking, boys. Same thing I was thinking. But let me tell you something. In January of 1968, covering the American rear end was no joke. It was dead serious business. And the men doing it weren't looking at anything except the tree line. Because in those green, wet, stinking jungles outside Bien Hoa, if you took your eyes off the shadows for 1 second, Charlie would remind you real fast why attention matters. So settle in, pour yourself something cold, and let's talk about Operation Coburg, the operation nobody back home ever heard of. The one where a handful of quiet, patient Australian SAS troopers kept an entire American flank from coming apart at the seams during the bloodiest month of the entire war. January 1968. The brass back in Saigon were feeling pretty good about themselves. General Westmoreland had been telling Washington for 2 years that the war was going in the right direction. The body counts looked right on paper. The press conferences sounded confident. The boys on the ground, though, the grunts, the real ones, the guys humping 60-pound packs through 100-degree heat with wet boots and bad food, those boys knew something was wrong. They could feel it the way an old dog feels a storm coming 3 days out. The jungle had gotten quiet. And in Vietnam, quiet didn't mean peaceful. Quiet meant Charlie was thinking. The American units operating in Phuoc Tuy province and the surrounding regions were stretched. And I mean stretched like a cheap rubber band around a watermelon. The 1st Australian Task Force had established their base at Nui Dat, and the Americans had their own operations running to the north and west. On the surface, it looked coordinated. On the ground, it was the usual Vietnam story. Good men, bad maps, and generals who hadn't slept in a jungle since Korea making decisions for guys who were sleeping in mud every night. The American flanks were exposed. Not because the grunts were careless. Those boys were brave as hell, every last one of them. But bravery doesn't cover ground. Bravery doesn't silently patrol 15 kilometers of dense jungle and come back knowing exactly where 300 Viet Cong are sleeping. That takes something different. That takes the kind of cold, patient, almost inhuman stillness that the Australian SAS had been perfecting since Borneo, since Malaya, since years and years of learning to be ghosts in green country. Operation Coburg officially kicked off in the last days of January 1968. And if that date rings a bell, it should. Because while Coburg was being planned, somewhere in the back rooms of Hanoi, General Giap and the North Vietnamese High Command were putting the final touches on something that would shake America to its core. The Tet Offensive was 72 hours away. And nobody on the Allied side, not the CIA, not Westmoreland's intelligence staff, not the fancy analysts in their air-conditioned offices, nobody knew exactly where the hammer was going to fall first. But the Australians had a feeling, because the Australians had been listening. That's the thing about the SAS diggers that most Americans never quite understood. And I say that with total respect for the American fighting man. The U.S. Army in Vietnam was built for power. Massive, overwhelming, earth-shaking power. You call in a B-52 arc-light strike, and 12 square kilometers of jungle turns into a parking lot. You bring in the air cav with Hueys and gunships, and you own the sky. American firepower in Vietnam was the most impressive military machine the world had ever seen. There was nothing wrong with the weapon. The problem was the hand that was swinging it. Because sometimes the brass wanted to use a sledgehammer when the job called for a scalpel. The Australian SAS were scalpels, 4 to 6 men, sometimes fewer, moving through the jungle so slowly and so quietly that the birds didn't stop singing. They would spend days, not hours, days, in an observation position, watching a trail, counting footprints, noting the time between patrols. They called it hard routine. No fires, cold food, whispers only. Sometimes no words at all, just hand signals and the silent language that men develop when their lives depend on not making noise. They would lie in the mud with insects crawling over them, and they would not move. Not because they were told to, because they understood, deep in their professional bones, that information was the most valuable weapon in that jungle. And you can't gather information if Charlie knows you're there. So while the American units were moving through Phuoc Tuy province with the subtlety of a freight train, and again, those were brave, hard men doing exactly what their orders called for. The Australian SAS patrols were threading through the same jungle like smoke through a keyhole. And what they were finding in those weeks before Tet was disturbing. Enemy movement, large scale, coordinated. Not the usual small groups of Viet Cong cadre moving supplies down local trails. These were main force units, NVA regulars mixed in with Viet Cong battalions. They were staging, positioning. The Australians sent their reports up the chain, and some of it got through, and some of it got lost in the beautiful bureaucratic fog that the Pentagon had created around the Vietnam War. But the SAS commanders on the ground trusted their boys, and they adjusted their dispositions accordingly. When Tet hit on the 30th of January 1968, it hit everywhere at once. Saigon, Hue, Khe Sanh. 67 provincial capitals attacked in a single coordinated night. The American command was not just surprised, it was stunned. Westmoreland's entire strategic narrative collapsed in about 4 hours. And in the chaos that followed, units all across South Vietnam suddenly found themselves reorienting, pulling back, shoring up positions they thought were secure, and desperately trying to figure out where the next attack was coming from. The American flank near the Australian area of operations became, overnight, a serious problem. The units that had been screening that flank had been redirected. There were gaps, real gaps. The kind of gaps that a determined NVA force could push through and cause absolute havoc in the rear areas, the supply lines, the communications nodes that the whole Allied operation in the region depended on. In military terms, you call that a vulnerability. In plain English, you call it a disaster waiting to happen. The Australians plugged that gap. Quietly, methodically, the way they did everything. The SAS squadrons operating under Coburg didn't wait for orders from someone in Saigon who was looking at a map on a wall. They knew the ground because they had walked every meter of it in the dark. They knew the trails Charlie used because they had watched him use them. They knew the creek crossings and the tree lines and the ambush positions because they had already sat in half of them themselves, watching. And in those critical days and weeks, when the American flank was bare and vulnerable, Australian SAS patrols were out there in the black, in the wet, covering ground that nobody else could cover the same way. They ran ambushes on the routes the enemy would have used to exploit that flank. Not loud, crashing, helicopter insertion ambushes. Silent, carefully laid, Textbook affairs. A small team, perfect ground, perfect timing. Charlie walks into it, and before he understands what's happening, it's over. And the survivors, if there were survivors, turned around. Because the jungle that had seemed open and exploitable suddenly felt like it was full of invisible, lethal things. Which it was. The weapon that defined the Australian SAS in that jungle was the Owen gun's spiritual successor. By 1968, most diggers were carrying the F-1 submachine gun alongside their SLRs. But the real edge wasn't hardware. The real edge was the man. Australian SAS selection was, and remains, one of the most brutally demanding processes in the world. You could give those men a sharp stick and a bad attitude, and they would still be more dangerous in that jungle than a platoon carrying M16s and a radio link to a fire support base. Because they thought like hunters. Patient, methodical, unhurried hunters. They were in no rush. Charlie was in no rush either, and that's why Charlie was dangerous. But the Australians matched that patience and then added training on top of it. That combination, in that terrain, was devastating. There's a story, and I've heard versions of this from more than one old soldier over the years, about a 4-man SAS patrol during Coburg that spent 11 days in the field without being detected, covering a critical trail junction that intelligence had flagged as a possible infiltration route. 11 days. Cold rations. Minimal water movement. One man awake at all times, the others in that half-dead stillness that experienced soldiers learn to fall into. In those 11 days, they counted, cataloged, and reported back every enemy movement through that junction. 3 separate NVA courier groups, 1 resupply column, 1 reconnaissance element, the really dangerous ones, the guys Charlie sent ahead to check if a route was clear. The Australians let the recon element pass, reported it, let the information flow back up the chain. Then, on the 11th day, when a larger group came through, they triggered their ambush, broke contact, and moved to extraction. Professional. Clean. No friendly casualties. Compare that to what the American approach to the same problem might have looked like in early 1968. Not because the Americans were bad soldiers. Say that again, because some of you boys in the comments might be grunts yourself, and I'm not here to disrespect the men who served. The American grunts were among the finest combat soldiers ever fielded by any nation. But the system they operated in demanded different things. Visibility, body counts, demonstrable action. A 4-man patrol lying in the mud for 11 days without shooting at anything didn't look good in a Westmoreland briefing. It didn't generate metrics. The brass wanted movement, wanted contact, wanted numbers. And so the system pushed American units toward exactly the kind of aggressive, noisy patrolling that made them effective in open firefights, and much less effective at the silent intelligence-gathering work that the jungle actually rewarded. The Australians had the luxury, if you can call it that, of a smaller commitment and a clearer mission. The 1st ATF in Phuc Tuy were responsible for their province. They owned it. They weren't being moved around to plug holes all over the country the way American units were. That stability allowed them to learn their ground in a way most American units never could. A digger who'd been in Phuc Tuy for 6 months knew things about that province that no map could tell you. Where the red laterite clay gave way to the black soil that turned to glue in the wet season. Which streams were crossable in January, and which ones would swallow a man. Which villages had old men who watched the road all day, and which ones had young men who disappeared at night. That kind of knowledge is worth more in counterinsurgency than almost any weapon system you can name.